Welcome to those of you that have joined, and I hope that today's going to be of some use. And you're clearly here because you're at least in some way curious about critical discourse studies. So what I wanted to do today was give you an overview about critical discourse studies, and really then we can think about how it might actually fit into your research. I don't know any of your backgrounds. Some of you might come from a more linguistic background. Some of you might come from political science, other sociologies, fields and stuff like that. So hopefully, or I'm guessing that some of you are interested or you've heard about critical discourse studies, but maybe aren't sure about how that can fit into a political science PhD or research project or whatever you're studying. So what I wanted to do today was a few things. We're going to start with sort of introducing what critical discourse studies really is and the aims of critical discourse studies. And then one thing that some of you might be worried about a little bit is sort of how linguistic critical discourse studies actually has to be. And then I want to think about maybe how you can consider integrating it into your project. And then finally, we'll have a look at the overview of the MethodsNET summer school course, which some of you are hopefully interested in. And it would be really nice to see you in Vienna later on this year. And then we're going to finish up, as my colleague Anna has just popped in the chat. There's going to be a Q&A afterwards as well. So really, what I want to start with is, and this is kind of like I've written, it's kind of the dirty secret that I don't normally tell MethodsNet. They don't know about this, but it's too late now. That I don't really understand critical discourse studies as a methodology, or at least not just a methodology. And I'll kind of explain why in a second. So what I think it's better to understand critical discourse studies is it's a heterogeneous set of approaches. It's not one approach. There's a flexibility there. And it's a set of approaches that allow us to try and understand and analyze the role of language and communication in how societies are structured. And I think that for me, having studied it, but not come from a linguistic background, I find that there are two parts to critical discourse studies. There's a theory side, and there's a methodology side. I understand of it almost collectively that almost critical discourse studies has us starting from a certain epistemological starting point. And if we follow those starting points, then critical discourse studies might be of interest to us. That doesn't mean to say that you can't just use critical discourse studies methodology. And it also doesn't mean to say that you only have to use the theory. And as I'll talk about it later on today, there's a flexibility in critical discourse studies, which is perhaps why it's so attractive to non-linguists as well. So I understand it really, as I said, as it's like this epistemological starting point, that really there's a few kind of key points to it. The first is that discourse shapes society and society shapes discourse. So there is a structure and there's an agency there. Now, different critical discourse scholars will be more into the structure and say that we don't actually have much choice over sort of what we say, should we say. Other people understand that there's a bit more agency there. But what we're really looking at is how discourse impacts society. For example, the discursive construction of policies or something like that. And then this impacts praxis in terms of actually how governments control people coming in and out of a country, for example. But on the other hand, society shapes discourse, meaning actually that we have to take into account the setting of any text, of any utterance or anything like that. So there's this socially constitutive and constituted element of discourse in society here. The other part of this epistemology, or one other part of this epistemology, is that within society, or society is structured by uneven power relations. So if we take into account that perhaps there are these uneven power relations in society, and that discourse shapes society and society shapes discourse, then we can consider perhaps whether critical discourse studies is for us. And just off the bat, it's worth noting that when it was created, when it was sort of first presented, I suppose, as an approach, critical discourse studies actually came from a basis in linguistics. Now, like I said, that doesn't mean to say that you have to be a linguist. I'm kind of a good example of this. My undergrad was in international relations, my postgrad was in peace studies, and when I came to do my PhD, I kind of fell into the Faculty of English here at my university. And I said, I want to write about discourse studies of migration. And my supervisor at the time said, that's wonderful, Sam, but what you're doing is not linguistic at all. So really, I had to learn the theory side of discourse studies and the theory side of linguistics, how language works at sort of a micro level. And from there, I kind of built it into my project, which to start with, which was much more sociological. It was about it was about the discursive construction of migration in the UK. So although it starts from a basis in linguistics, it doesn't mean to say that you actually have to you don't have to be a linguist. That said, later on, I'll kind of argue that the language side of things is one of the major strengths of doing critical discourse studies. So what critical discourse research has really kind of started with the idea was that we need to look at language in context, that language is something live, so it's something living, it's something that has a function, it's a form of social interaction. It's about meaning making, so semiotic. And on top of that, the knowledge that we have within society is constructed through interaction with others. So this kind of went against a lot of what linguistics was doing at the time in sort of the 50s and 60s, 70s, really, which was looking at the levels of grammar, syntax, and everything like that. Now, some of you might know Noam Chomsky from his politics, but actually he's a linguist. He was a linguist by trade. It was his work on syntax, ironically, that really kind of pushed the idea of looking at language in context. So like I said, we have this idea that discourse shapes society and society shapes discourse, or as a lot of critical discourse analysts will sort of take a more sort of a Foucauldian understanding of this. So that discourses are practices that form the objects of which they speak. So we've got this constitutional and constituted element of this. This doesn't mean to say, unlike discourse theory, which would be Leclau and Mouffe's work, that everything is discourse. I think that critical discourse analysts take a sort of a slightly less totalizing understanding, but it is close to discourse theory. Another part of sort of the background of critical discourse studies is that within this understanding of language as a form of meaning making, the choices that we have in language, and you'll all know this by learning a language and possibly a second or third language as well. When we think about the grammar structure of a sentence, we have the structure, but the words that we put into that structure are, if not infinite, then there's a large sort of difference in that. We can think about the use of different grammar structures. We can think about the use of different words that will change the meaning of what we're arguing about or talking about. A good example is the difference between, if we're looking at a social movement, constructing it as a protest versus constructing it as a riot versus constructing it as a march. Now, all of those are nouns, and in a sentence structure, they would fit in the same place. But the load, the meaning that those words hold to us change our understanding of a report on this particular social movement, right? So for critical discourse analysts, language choice is believed to be ideological. And I don't mean ideological in the right-left politics side of things, but more in the worldview understanding of ideology. So it's believed to be ideological in the sense that discourse is not objective, and so there's a function to the language that people use. From Norman Fairclough, who was one of the instigators of critical discourse studies in the mid-90s, there's no arbitrariness in the signs that we use. So when we construct language, when we start talking, especially when we're thinking about texts that have been prepared, so political speeches or texts that are used for a specific purpose, again, maybe trying to convince someone to vote one way or another, or a policy document, for example. There's a reason why we use certain words, and quite often that's role is to convince people, or perhaps to scare people, or to encourage people, entice people. And so we can understand language as a system of options. This comes from Barbara Johnston's 2002 book on discourse analysis. So linguistic choices are strategic in the sense that every utterance has an epistemological agenda, a way of seeing the world that's favored via that choice and not others. And it's through these choices about lexical choice, genre, style, grammar, and ways of thinking that ways of thinking can be manipulated. So I think manipulated is a strong word here, but we're talking about how the use of certain language is received in different ways by different people. Now, some of the aims of critical discourse studies was to start with, really, a group of people that started as linguists, but also were interested in social inequality. And so CDA is historical, CDS-CDA, has historically been problem-oriented. What I mean by this is that researchers have gravitated to wanting to look at social inequalities and the discursive and textual manifestations of these inequalities. Having said that, as critical discourse studies has developed over the last 30 years and it's strengthened its methodologies, it's actually started to be used in a lot of other cases, a lot of other perspectives. My personal view is that quite often when people say they're doing critical discourse studies, or they take a critical discourse approach, they're actually using critical discourse methodologies, and that's absolutely fine. But I also think that there's the theoretical side of things as well. And I'll talk about some criticisms of critical discourse studies later on in the discussion. So some of the aims of critical discourse studies is to have a look at those linguistic choices that I spoke about on the previous slide, but also to look at their effects and the motivation behind them. So we're looking not just at the text, but the effects of those texts, right? Or the reasons behind those texts. For Jaeger, it's the role of critical discourse studies is to critique these dominant discourses and reveal their contradictions or the non-expressions. Whereas for Weiss and Bodak, the aim is to demystify these discourses. So the way I explain it to my students at MA and BA level and when I do the workshops is that what we're really looking at is the tensions inherent in language, especially which we find in exclusionary language, right? That perhaps one thing is being said on a sort of a rhetorical level, but if we compare that with policy, or if we actually look at the difference between the headline and the main meat of an article, we can actually see the tensions or the contradictions. And this is kind of part of what critical discourse is about. And I think that also one thing to think about is when we think about linguistic choice, one important part of linguistic choice is actually what we include and what we don't include. So we really need to think about what is there on the text, on the page, as it were, but also what's not there and how that gets hidden. And this can be done in terms of what topics are spoken about, but this can also be done at a grammatical level through, for example, the passive voice, right? Where we don't know who the actor is. When we hear that people were shot, we don't know who did the shooting, right? We also don't know, using the word shot, whether they were killed, whether they were injured, right? So there's a lot of information that might be missing in some construction. So we need to look at what's there, but we also need to look equally just as what's not there. And I think for that, we need to understand a more sort of a wider understanding of context, really. One of these examples, sort of these funny examples, or maybe not funny, but we've all probably been in these instances where we've heard a disclaimer like this: I'm not racist, but, and we all know that if someone uses that disclaimer, this I'm not racist, but, then the next thing that's going to come out of somebody's mouth is probably likely to be a bit racist. Or at the very least, the person who is saying it is worried that what they're going to say comes out as racist, right? So in here, this first bit, the I'm not racist, is an understanding, it's a face-saving move by the speaker to say, hang on, I know that racism is socially taboo, or this is how I understand it. At the same time, my viewpoint is exclusionary, but I don't want to be called a racist. So we have this, I'm not racist, but there's a disclaimer that kind of tries to reduce the power of what they're going to say, right? So this is one example of how messages and information can be backgrounded or given less power, shall we say. And so, as I said, what we really want to look at is an idea of, if we want to understand critical discourse studies and maybe how it changed from these initial linguistics of looking at syntax and grammar, what we look at is texts inside a context, right? Within society, that language is about meaning making. And if we're interested in language as meaning making, then we have to understand not just the text, but we also have to understand at the contexts in which they're produced. So as I write here, these social inequalities that critical discourse scholars are somewhat drawn to, they're established and then maintained through two things, really. The use of certain language, it could be exclusionary language, or it could be rhetorical language or something like that. But also, and just as importantly, it's about the control over the means of discourse production and distribution. So we need to look at texts, but we also need to look at practices. So in what contexts are texts produced? Who gets to speak? When do they get to speak? Who is excluded from speaking? What are some, for example, of the demographic markers that might change an interaction? Okay. We need to think about the setting. If it's an interview, who has the power in an interview? If we are thinking about analyzing classroom discourses, let's think about the role of the teacher and the production over time of social understandings of what the teacher should do and what students should do. Okay, so all of this is a level of context. All of these are certain levels of context that we might want to take into account. And what this really means is that we have, in critical discourse studies, the need to look at both the micro level and the macro level of analysis. So we analyze at the linguistic level, but we also analyze at the level of the sentence or of the text, but we also need to expand our understandings so that we can interpret these texts. If we're just reading a text, if I was going to give any of you a newspaper article, you might be able to pick out things, words that you think maybe shouldn't be there, or give us lots of information, or frame a reporting in a certain way. But to be able to understand that, to be able to interpret that text, as researchers, you need to have a certain level of knowledge, right, about some of the meta language that's used, the name or the type of the newspaper, whether it's free or whether it's paid for, whether it's online or whether it's offline, the political standing of the paper, all of these things you might want to take into account. And then we can go a level up. We can think about, how does this text relate to other texts within a wider discourse of, for example, trans exclusion or something like that? So this means that we end up taking quite a hermeneutic approach, this constant kind of zooming in and out from the text, up and down. And so we've got these levels of context. We've got the textual level. We've got to consider, or we can consider, the genre or the setting. We can consider the societal knowledge that's needed to understand the text as well, right? We can consider the socio-political contexts. And we can also, if we're going sort of as far back as, or even further back, we can also consider the historical contexts, okay? So how does history impact current day discourses? What are the intertextual relations? What are the allusions to the past? We're seeing a lot at the moment in America, but in other countries where we're seeing the rise of the far right, of these recontextualizations of actions, for example, be it a Nazi salute or a so-called Roman salute, or quotes from other books that then become used in a wider present, in a more up-to-date speech. And so we've got this constant moving up and down between these levels. It's never just looking at the texts. There's this constant, like I said, of this moving in and out, this zooming in and out. As I said at the beginning, really, I think the critical discourse studies, or I know the critical discourse studies, is extremely heterogeneous. And this means that really, in terms of the methodology, in terms of what you're interested in, there's a whole range of different approaches that I think means that you can find a methodological approach that really fits what you're interested in, or really fits maybe your research project, okay? So if you're looking, or if you're interested in the construction of in-groups and out-groups, of social identities and how people are excluded and included or something like that, then there is a lot of critical discourse studies that works on that. I would argue that that's kind of where it started. Most critical discourse studies, actually, the methodologies and the theories started looking at racism and exclusion, and it's expanded from there. So we can look at the construction of in-groups and out-groups. Some of you might be less interested in that, but you might be interested in how certain concepts or key values in society or within a policy discourse have changed over time, or how they're interpreted by different people within politics. So with that, we could use Michał Krzyżanowski's discourse conceptual approach. If we're interested in how history impacts upon current discourses, then we could look at using the discourse historical approach from Ruth Wodak. If we're interested in, for example, how politicians legitimize certain standpoints, then we can look at Theo van Leuven's work on legitimation, or we can look at argumentation and rhetoric if we're looking at political persuasion from Martin Riesgo and also my colleagues Dimitris Serafis and Salome Bukala. If we're more interested in the cognitive side of things and how we interpret language, then we can look at cognitive linguistic critical discourse studies from someone like Chris Hart, and that would also include looking at the role of metaphor and critical metaphor analysis. Now, my course with MethodsNET is a qualitative, I deal specifically with qualitative discourse analysis, but more and more we're seeing critical discourse studies being done as quantitative corpus analyses, network analyses, and there's some very, very good work being done there. And that sort of goes back to the mid-2000s, really, and that's really sort of been a big boom in both publications in critical discourse studies, but also as a way of making critical discourse studies stronger. What we do see generally, that even if you are taking a quantitative approach, you'll end up with some type of quant-qual blend, because you will do your quantitative analysis and then you're likely to do a qualitative analysis on some of the excerpts that you find, right? But in my course that I teach, I don't look at quantitative analysis. That doesn't mean to say that they're not good. I actually think they're really, really good. We had a speaker at a conference last year that I organized, and she blew my mind as making corpus studies very, for someone that's not into anything quantitative, she made it very straightforward and extremely engaging. And it might be that some of you would want to take a more computational linguistics or corpus analysis, especially if you're looking at sort of social media, or you want to looking at how discourse networks are constructed and stuff like that. Now, you might be worrying that I've kind of sort of sold so far critical discourse studies as quite linguistic, and you might be thinking, oh, well, actually, this isn't for me. How does it kind of fit into my non-linguistic, maybe broadly discursive research? And I think that you don't have to worry too much about this. Like I said, even if you do want to take a more linguistic understanding, then I'm probably a good example of this, of having to learn the linguistic side of things and build that up. And that's something that I'm still learning sort of 15, 20 years on, right? But critical discourse studies is extremely heterogeneous, and it's flexible as well. You don't, like, as I was saying at the beginning, it's not one approach. And because it's not one approach, you can, to some extent, mix and match, and you can take certain things from one part of critical discourse studies, or you can take certain elements of it, and you don't have to kind of go completely 100% in on the whole of it. It's interdisciplinary, meaning that if you're going to do a critical discourse analysis, you're going to do the linguistic analysis, but you also have to have a specialist hat on of maybe media and communication or international relations or political theory or legal theory or something like that. So quite often we find critical discourse projects actually including a lot of specialists, right? It's also cross-disciplinary. And what I mean by this is that it's used nowadays by a lot of non-linguists already. And I would say that the journals that I cooperate with, probably I would say 50% of, or maybe even more, 60, 70% of our papers are not from linguists. They're from more people in political science. So it's used in political science, it's used in international relations, it's used in sociology, it's used in religion, it's used in environmental studies, or especially environmental policy and sustainability. It's used in people who are studying education and critical education, people who are doing media and communication studies and everything like that. So there is a flexibility there, and it definitely is used by non-linguists, I would say. And I think you can be as linguistic as you feel comfortable with. If you want, you can emphasize the theory more, and say, look, I understand language as a system of choice, and there are unequal power relations, and language is about meaning making, which is why I want to look at discourse, broadly understood. Or it might be that you want to use methodology more, and you've got your theory from your political science or what have you, but you've got some data and you're not sure how to analyze that data. And so in that case, you can take some of the methodologies that critical discourse studies offers and apply it, sometimes maybe even in a non-critical way, because we're dealing with sort of these analytical toolboxes. My sort of bugbear with that is that a lot of people end up saying they're doing critical discourse analysis, and they're not. They're using a methodological toolkit, but there's no critical analysis involved, should we say. It's a linguistic analysis, or it's a discourse analysis, or it's a content analysis, but it's not a critical discourse analysis. That just might be me being sort of someone from the inside that's interested in how it's used. But I do think that that's an important thing to point out. But like that said, though, I do think that the language element adds something, right? It can add a level of proof or a level of robustness if we follow the theoretical underpinnings and we look at the linguistic side of things, and this is interesting to us, then I think that we can kind of, that there's space for us there. As I was saying just now, non-linguists tend to see critical discourse studies as a methodology and see it as something additive rather than something central that then they produce a research project around. And again, that's not a problem per se. One of the dangers in that, though, lies in overinterpretation. So if you're not using these methodologies closely, what you can end up with really is or a researcher will just paraphrase what they have read in a text or something like that and say, oh, and this is exclusionary, or this shows power imbalances or something like that. And then I think that's a problem, because that's just you being that's subjective overinterpretation. Using these methodologies and showing how it works in language, referring back to different linguistic theories, can actually give you this level of proof to say, well, actually, if you understand language as a form of communication set up within unequal power relations, then this is how it's done. And so sometimes, as a fan of modernism and the Bauhaus, I go back to this idea of less is more. And consider how much critical discourse studies you want to include into your project, right? Within that, consider, and especially if you're not within linguistics, consider what your supervisor, what your institution, and what your reviewers will accept, okay? You don't want to do it too linguistic, so that if you're doing international relations, someone will turn around and say, oh, this is a linguistic research project. It's not an IR project, or it's not a political science project. So before you go down into that route of doing critical discourse studies, you're going to need to think about whether it's going to work for your research project. And I kind of mean that more institutionally rather than the actual content of it. And within that, how linguistic is it going to be? And then also think about what support you might need. Does this mean you're going to need a secondary supervisor that has experience in looking at critical discourse studies? If you've only got one supervisor and that supervisor has no real idea about what critical discourse studies is about, they're not going to be in a place to support you, which probably means that in the end, your research, your findings are not going to be as strong because you're sort of running blind, right? So do consider that about sort of what you want to take into account. And when it comes to integrating critical discourse studies into your project, there's sort of different places where that works. So it can work on the level of the text that maybe you've already picked up on, that you've already started collecting, and then you do your linguistic analysis. But it also comes in at a level above that, at a level of sort of considering how discourse works in society, so this socially constituted element side of things. It can come in terms of middle range theories, and with this I mean that we're using critical discourse studies, but to be able to interpret those texts, we might need other theories as well. For example, theories of gender, theories of race, theories of class. And then at the top, you've got these grand theories, right? Which might be more, I'm trying to think, the big one that critical discourse studies uses is sort of a post-Marxist approach, right? And it's really, like I said, it's depending on what you're interested in, critical discourse studies to some extent fits in with all of these, right? So how can we start thinking about a project that includes CDS? Well, I think that at base, you want to think about what you're interested in. Why is this an issue worthy of researching? But then most importantly for you is what's the discursive or linguistic element, right? What is it in there that lends itself to CDS? Or what is it in there that CDS lends itself to, right? What are you trying to get out of it? Thinking about your research questions. Why the language side of things? Why the discourse side of things? And once you've got an idea about that, then I think other things become clear, right? The other thing to think about really is where we start with a project that looks at critical discourse studies. Some people, and this might be more of a more linguistically inclined researchers, will look at the text and the discourse themselves. We'll look at it from a very linguistic side of things and say, I'm interested in how, on a textual level, people are excluded. And that's absolutely fine. But it might be that you're coming from a policy perspective. And what you're interested in is you're looking at policies and you're looking at the praxis of, for example, migration or immigration policy. Okay. And part of what you're looking at is how migration policy constructs migration or citizenship or something like that. And so for you, it's looking more at the context and the genre and how certain policies are discursively constructed. So the language thing gets you to somewhere else. Maybe if you're more into a sociological side of things, then it might be that you're interested in the effect. So what is the effect of exclusionary discourses? Is it barriers to employment? Is it increased reports of racial hatred via the police or something like that? So depending on what you're interested in, it's going to kind of somehow frame how you use critical discourse studies. But it doesn't mean to say that you have to start with just the discourse, right? All of these kind of link in with each other. If you're going to do a big project, you might want to look at all three of these, but that can be sort of like any PhD project or MA project. That can, be careful about biting off more than you can chew, right? When it comes to the data, a lot of you might already have considered where you get your data from, but it can really come from anywhere, I think. A lot of people who study critical discourse analysts, shall we say, look at social media discourse or media discourses. Other will look at policy documents. Other will be more interested in speeches. Others will be interested in interviews or focus groups, legal documents. But what we're dealing with here is largely, for want of a better phrase, real-world texts. Okay. My personal view is that critical discourse studies is not particularly well set up to studying films, books, stuff like that. Doesn't mean to say that it can't be. I've got a colleague of mine that is. But I think that there are literary theories and other theories that probably work better for literary analysis, right? And there are other frames that you can use for film analysis that you might want to bring into your analyses, but I don't think critical discourse studies really works with them personally. Some other considerations when it comes to your data is that quite a lot of data nowadays is multimodal, right? So we need to look at the role of images as well. It could be moving images, or it could be stills, or it could be GIFs. It could be lots of different things, right? But a lot of people now are starting to do multimodal analysis. Another thing we might want to think about is triangulation. And this, I think, is really important. That when we think about certain exclusionary discourses, they don't just happen in one space. They happen, like I said, at the level of policy, but they also happen in the media, and they also happen in public. You have a level of different genres even within political discourses, speeches, etc., etc. So you might want to consider how you can triangulate your data. What different types of data do you want to collect and analyze that will help you answer your research questions? Or are you more focused, and are you only going to be looking at one form of discourse production? Again, it could be policy documents. Absolutely fine. You don't have to triangulate, right? But quite a lot of my students, former students from MethodsNET, have, after the course, decided that looking at one type of data is not enough, that they want to expand it, right? The other thing, and this is probably worth remembering, when we're dealing with online documents and policy documents, recordings of speeches and stuff like that, a lot of the data we're dealing with is impermanent. So once you've located it, you're going to want to save it and save copies of it as quickly as possible. We can see, for example, what's happening in the US and the taking down of certain web pages and stuff like that. So I think this is an important thing to kind of think about in the background, is that what data is there? I had a problem when I was finishing off my most recent book. It was more of a referencing problem, and I thought, oh, I'll just come back and grab the reference later on. And before I knew it, the website that I was analyzing had completely changed. And so I didn't have a permanent record of what was there, right? So that's problematic for me. And really kind of maybe to finish up on this before we have a look at the course. A critical discourse analysis isn't linear. You're constantly kind of zooming in and out from the discourse and the text, interpreting it, examining your assumptions, going back to the theory, going back to the discourse and text. It's worth doing a case study to start with, or a limited study to see what's there. You might find that you're coming up in your data with things that you didn't think was going to be there. So that's absolutely fine. You come back, you reconceptualize, you select different theoretical or methodological approaches, and you come back into your analysis of the text. That's how I work. At base, language is messy, right? It's messy and it's complex, and that means that we have to be open and flexible in how we understand and how we analyze it. And finally, just to finish up again before sort of introducing the course, one of the reasons that you might be here is that you've heard criticisms of CDS, or some of your supervisors might be sort of a bit wary about introducing it to your research. So there are a couple of issues that I think are there, and they may be worth talking about just for a second. A criticism that happens with CDS, historically, people have asked, critical discourse studies, why are you taking into account power relations in studies of language? I mean, the simple answer to that is why wouldn't? I mean, it's a perfectly reasonable ontological standpoint that there are inequalities in the world. So why would you not include that in your understanding of how language works, right? Another one we have is a cherry picking of the data, that we're only showing the nasty bits, right? We're not showing everything that's there, that our analyses are over-interpretive. To that, what we've had is over time, critical discourse studies developing its methodologies so that it isn't over-interpreted. It's based in these quite strict linguistic analyses. And also given the introduction of corpus analyses, we don't have as much of the cherry pick, right? We're actually being led by the data a lot more than perhaps critical discourse scholars were maybe 20 years ago. Another criticism is that it's too conceptually heterogeneous. Again, this is something that's sort of been corrected over time, and it's much more conceptually clear, I think. But also within that, you need to define your terms of engagement whenever you're writing a paper, right? You need to define what you understand as a text, what you understand as a discourse, how you understand ideology, how you understand knowledge, the role of language, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So these are things that you need to make clear and have a good understanding of, so that your theory is, if not watertight, then as strong as possible. And then very quickly, another one that we have is maybe how critical is critical discourse studies now? And this is something that we go into a lot more in the course, right? That maybe it's not quite as critical as it used to be, and there's a need for critical discourse studies to be a bit more self-reflexive of that. So going to the actual course, which you can find more on, and Anna has sent the link there, but it's worth sort of just going over it. The course really has three aims. One is to understand in more depth, that we've studied a little bit today, the relationship between texts and the wider societal, political, historical context in which they're produced. So really looking at how this relationship between language and society. Practically speaking, we actually deal with a lot of texts. Okay, so this is a lot of practice of methodologies, learning what to look for in language, learning to analyze texts at more or less interpretive, more or less in-depth levels. So we do a lot of real analysis during the course, basically every day. We look at newspaper articles, we look at cartoons, we look at videos, we look at social media, we look at policy documents, and there's also space for you to bring in your own text that we can analyze as a group. And then the other thing is sort of a more practical element, is that towards or throughout the course, you're going to learn how to construct a project that's related to your own studies using critical discourse studies as this central approach, methodological, theoretical approach, right? So really, hopefully by the end of the course, you can feel confident in where CDS fits into your course, right? It might be that after the course, you realize, no, CDS isn't for me. And I think even that is a bonus, because then at least you know not to do it. So it works like this. In day one, we look at some key concepts, but also we kind of shape the course. So as I said, there's a bit of a flexibility there. Based on what my students need, we can shape later days so that your weaknesses, your questions are answered, right? We go into some more analyses on day two. We look at the introduction to the group presentations, which is kind of the big sort of assignment that I give you, and how to build a project. We look at different approaches, different methodological approaches to critical discourse studies, how and what to analyze depending on the data that you're dealing with. We look on day four at multimodality, especially, which is something that a lot of you will be dealing with and analyzing. Sometimes we look at analyzing social media. We'll also look at how critical discourse studies works with other social theories as well, which you'll need to be using. Decolonial theories, I focus on myself, but not just. And then on day five, we have the group presentations, which are normally extremely good quality before we kind of wrap up with a quick evaluation. Just to go back to it, and this is kind of to show actually the practical outcomes of the course, right? I'm kind of proud about two of my students. One is Mark Delson, who was with me 2 years ago at the MethodsNET Summer School. And And he recently had his first paper published. And he decided to integrate legitimation, which we were looking at during the class. He published it in the Journal of Language and Politics, and it was a very good article. And I got some really nice feedback from him saying, thanks for the course and the support. And, this is kind of showing that what we learn on the course actually gets you somewhere, right? And then with Catherine, who I had last year, she approached me after the course saying, look, I really want to use critical discourse studies, but I'm working within sort of gender studies and sociology. And we agreed for me to be one of her sort of secondary supervisors for her PhD, so that she has that level of support, right? That she feels confident that she can integrate CDS so that she doesn't do it badly. And again, this is something I would offer to my students as well, right? So just wrapping up, maybe a few sort of quick takeaways, that there's a relationship between discourse and society, that if we're going to do a critical discourse analysis, it should or it could include the analyses, not just of texts, but of contexts and also practices as well. It's a very heterogeneous approach, which is flexible, which means that actually it's open to being used by non-linguists and non-specialists, I think. But having said that, be careful of that over-interpretation in your analysis. And the other sort of takeaway would obviously be, if you're interested, then please do sign up for the course. It's a really sort of interesting, intense, and because we get so many people on the course from different fields, really different fields, then we have a lot of shared expertise, or we have a lot of different expertise, and that actually builds up into some really interesting projects. So I'll leave it there, and I'll open up the floor to any questions or anything like that. Thank you. So yeah, if you do want to, no questions. Okay, fine. If there's no questions, if you do want to ask a question, you can pop it in the question and answer page. It might be that you want to contact me directly afterwards. You're more than welcome to email me. And you can find me on Blue Sky as well if you want to sort of catch me or something like that. So if there's anything that comes later, then that's absolutely fine. But hopefully, if you have any questions about the course or signing up for MethodsNet, then Anna would be able to help you with that. If it's more about critical discourse studies, then do let me know.